Welcome back, mitochondriacs, for another episode of Cancer, a mitochondrial metabolic disease. I'm glad to be back with you today talking about things that can lower blood glucose. And when we lower blood glucose, that makes us more effective at employing metabolic therapy as a whole. And it gets our GKI down, our glucose ketone index down where we want it to be. And I'm looking forward to sharing on a couple of new, I wouldn't say new, but different compounds or natural substances that we can go over today that are in line with those goals. And what's also cool is that two of the three compounds today we have talked about several times in the past for its ability to block glutamine. And the substances we're going to talk about today are going to be quercetin, EGCG, and garlic. And we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about EGCG and the limitations of the scientific literature. So let me pull up the necessary slides here. Share. Okay. So we left off on cardamom, and I'm going to break this down into several different kind of smaller videos, even though they tend to go somewhat long. Because if we just did it all in one, we would be here for hours and hours, and we can't do that. So I'm looking forward to sharing first on EGCG. So EGCG, so it says here in this paper, the intrinsic virtues of EGCG, an extremely good cell guardian on prevention and treatment of diabetes complications. The pandemic proportion of diabetes, a combination of obesity and diabetes, sets a worldwide health issue. Experimental and clinical studies have progressively reinforced the pioneering epidemiological observation of an inverse relationship between the consumption of polyphenol-rich nutraceutical agents and mortality from cardiovascular and metabolic diseases. With chemical identification of epicatogen 3 gallate, EGCG, as the most abundant catechin in green tea, a number of cellular and molecular mechanisms underlying the activities of this unique catechin have been proposed. Favorable effects of EGCG have been initially attributed to its scavenging effects on free radicals, inhibition of ROS generating mechanisms, and upregulation of antioxidant enzymes. And it later says here, despite unceasing research providing detailed insights, EGCG composite activities are not completely understood. This review summarizes the most recent evidence on molecular mechanisms by which EGCG may activate signal transduction pathways, regulate transcription factors, and promote epigenetic changes that may contribute to the pathologic process involved in diabetes and its cardiovascular complications. Now, this paper was published in 2020, so this was the most up-to-date kind of science at that time, obviously. And, you know, this graphic is pretty busy, but it's probably best summarized, you know, by the little, you know, blurb of information below it. So it says here that it activates AMPK, PIK3 to enhance insulin sensitivity, promoting uptake of glucose into cells. Catechins attenuate the inhibitory effects of NF-kappa B. So basically, when there's an inflammatory response, and it will suppress certain redox chemicals. Catechins promote glucose-stimulating insulin secretion by increasing mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation and ATP, while increasing mitochondrial biogenesis and reducing mitochondrial-associated enzyme-induced apoptosis of beta cells. So we actually don't lose the cells making insulin, and we actually make them more effective at producing insulin when they're needed through multiple mechanisms, including through increasing mitochondrial function, through increasing mitochondrial biogenesis, reducing ER stress or endoplasmic reticulum stress by alleviating this UPR, and leads to IRS related decrease in insulin signaling. The bottom line is this molecule affects at least within the pancreas, in this particular paper, they're mostly talking about pancreatic function or pancreatic beta cell function. It affects the problem at multiple levels. Okay. So one would think, by at least from looking at this paper at face value, that there's going to be a profound effect on EGCG, on our ability to handle glucose and put it where it needs to go and keep it from where it's not supposed to be at in the bloodstream. This next paper, which titled in 2022, was authored in 2022 or released in 2022, and it says the role of catechins in regulating diabetes, an update review. And it says in this paper, we summarize the research on the underlying mechanisms of catechins in regulating diabetes and elaborate on the mechanisms of catechins in alleviating hyperglycemia by improving insulin resistance, alleviating oxidative stress, regulating mitochondrial function, alleviating endoplasmic reticulum stress, producing anti-inflammatory effects, reducing blood sugar source, and regulating intestinal function. So pretty diverse actions. As a matter of fact, it's even more so diverse than this particular graphic leads on. They found additional mechanisms in which it works. One of the ways that it works was also, as it says here in part 6, it says catechins decrease the source of blood glucose by reducing activities of related enzymes such as GK, GP, G6PAs, PEP, CK, alpha amylase, alpha glucosidase, and improvements in activity of GS by promoting glycogen synthesis. So one of the ways that EGCG reduces blood sugar essentially is that it doesn't allow it to be absorbed. Some of these enzymes we're talking about here are specifically alpha amylase and alpha glucosidase are responsible for breaking down glucose in the actual gut lumen when you eat a food that has carbohydrates, and it blocks that from being able to break it down and be absorbed. One of the other ways that it does it is it actually improves this GS or glycogen synthase. So basically it makes your body store more glucose if it's available and promotes the synthesis of glycogen, again, as a way to remove it from the bloodstream. And then lastly, it talks about catechins regulating diabetes to improve the gut barrier, balancing the gut microbiome, and promoting secretion of glucose-related gut hormones. So this was another graphic taken from that same paper, and I'm not going to completely go over all the mechanisms of how EGCG works, but EGCG is an unbelievable catechin or polyphenol or flavonoid, and it has antioxidant effects, antiviral effects, anti-obesity effects, diabetic effects, other activities. We've obviously talked about it from some degree of its anti-tumor effects, as well as anti-inflammatory. This is a really complicated graphic that I'm not going to go over, and it's very small print. It would be very difficult to go over, but it's basically outlining the mechanisms seen in this particular figure or in this particular text. It was underneath this graphic. And ultimately, at the conclusion of this study, it said that in summary, catechins modulate diabetes mellitus via multiple pathways, improving insulin resistance, reducing oxidative stress, regulating mitochondrial function, reducing ER stress, having anti-inflammatory effects, lowering blood glucose sources, modulating intestinal function. The use of catechins in managing diabetes remains contentious, but most findings imply that catechins in catechin-rich diets, such as green tea intake, can have various beneficial effects on diabetes mellitus patients. Therefore, catechins are a potential multi-target treatment for diabetes, but also require future research in the future. So keep that in mind. Still, this is a common thing that we'll see throughout a lot of medical literature. When something is promising, has proof of concept, or has rodent studies, or even like some animal studies, it'll always say more work needs to be done. More work needs to be done, and it seems as if it's kind of like a three-pronged issue, right? Number one, it's saying we need more data so we can have more definitive understanding and data. Okay, fair enough. Then it's like we need more funding, right? So part of that is a funding call, right? Please fund our lab so we can do another study, right? Because the researchers require grants or big pharma to jump in, right? And then because EGCG is natural, it's not going to get studied, or at least not to the degree that it should, okay? And some of these important pathologies. Remember, keep that in mind. We're going to talk about that. The next paper is titled Catechins and Proanthocyanidins Involvements in Metabolic Syndrome. And it says the present review aims to selectively evaluate the benefits of catechins and their polymeric structure on metabolic syndrome, a common disorder characterized by a cluster of three main risk factors: obesity, hypertension or high blood pressure, hyperglycemia, prediabetes, diabetes, etc. Right? So it's talking about those three risk factors. But I'm going to focus us on the diabetes and insulin resistance, because again, we're talking in this particular part of the series. I want to focus on glucose lowering effects, because that is how we improve our GKI, right? And although I would love to see, as some people have asked for in the comments, they're like, well, I would love to see how this affects someone who doesn't have diabetes. Me and you both. I mean, I would love to see it as well. It's just that we have the studies we have, and even the studies we have, we don't have enough of them. So in here, we see that it has effects on the glucose transporters. It has effects on how your body manages glucose homeostasis. We've talked about in the last paper, alpha glucosidase and the enzymes that actually break down carbohydrates in our gut so they can be absorbed, as well as other enzymes. And the next paper, which shows promise in this area, it was published just a month ago in Nutrients, December 18th, 2024. And it says here, exploring the potential of epigallocatechin gallate in combating insulin resistance and diabetes. And I'm just going to be very upfront. This study was done in WinStar rats, okay? And they basically induced diabetes in these WinStar rats using streptomycin, and then they were examined when they gave varying doses of EGCG in a mg per kg dosing, okay, milligram per kilogram dosing. And it seems like they had a 50 milligram per kilogram, 100 milligram per kilogram, and 200 milligrams per kilogram. And then what they looked at was the effects after a certain period of time. In this case, they used a 3-week time course, day 0, day 14, and day 21. And so it says here at the doses of 100, 200 milligrams per kilogram, EGCG has the potential to help control diabetes by most effectively improving insulin resistance and beta cell function. The study results suggest that EGCG, especially at high doses, is an effective component in the treatment of diabetes and management of insulin resistance. The inclusion of EGCG as a natural flavonoid in the medical nutrition therapy may contribute to glycemic control and improve insulin resistant or insulin sensitivity in individuals with diabetes. These findings suggest that EGCG may be an alternative option in the treatment of diabetes, and future studies may help clarify potential benefits in this area. Again, future studies, aka we need more funding. We have proof of concept, we need more funding. Okay, so I'm going to kind of look at this graphic. I'm going to particularly look at the first two top. I wish I had one for A1C, but they didn't check that in these rats. So let's look at fasting blood glucose. So they have the control, which is the three different groups that got different things, and you see that this is at day 0, right? So day 0 of they got their blood sugar was 442, and this is measured in milligrams per deciliter, just like us. And then there was a group that got, there was day 14 and day 21. So this is the control group of the entire study, okay? Then there was the control group of 50 milligrams per kilogram. So day 0 was 416, very comparable. And then 304 at day 14 and 212 for day 21. So in 21 days, their blood sugar dropped by 50%, with the 50 milligrams per kilogram. At 100 milligrams per kilogram, it went from 370 to 179 after 21 days. And what the most impressive was at 200 milligrams per kilogram, it went from 411 down to 103. So a huge drop of blood glucose, okay? The fasting insulin this is somewhat misleading or difficult to maybe grasp. Okay, so in general, we want your fasting insulin levels to be very low. Okay, however, in these particular studies, they were actually giving something that induced diabetes. And one of the ways that induces diabetes is it damages the pancreatic beta cells in the liver. Okay. So when we see increasing amounts of fasting insulin, what that's showing us in this case is not that it's that we're having a negative effect. Okay. Like we would normally think about fasting insulins for preventive medicine, looking at a fasting insulin at Quest or at LabCorp or whatever. What they're looking at is showing regeneration of the pancreas and the pancreatic beta cells at varying doses of EGCG. And we see here it has the most profound effect at the 200 milligrams per kilogram. We see that there's very little effect, actually. It's pretty much the same as a control, except for at 200 milligrams per kilogram. And it has an effect that's pretty much immediate. After day 14, you see a significant rise, and then again another significant rise. And what that is essentially is allowing these rats to do is allowing them to put glucose where it needs to go, right? And insulin is going to get rid of glucose when there's no insulin resistance. So that amount of insulin that was probably necessary to deal with the blood sugar, and that allowed them to have a better situation. Now, I'm going to go. This was a 2024 paper. This is a month-old paper. They're still testing it on rats. They haven't really done a whole lot with humans. There was a paper from 2011. Okay, this is the only paper that I could personally find that really looked at A1C. Okay, for humans, it was a double-blind, randomized controlled trial of these obese diabetics. And what they did was they gave it for 16 weeks. And they didn't even give EGCG. They just gave green tea extract, so who knows how much EGCG was actually in that particular, formulation. I had to probably dig into the studies, the actual methods, and see if it actually tells us. Bottom line is that there was a statistically significant drop of 0.4% A1C from 8.4 to 8. So not a huge drop. Definitely like the studies and looking at all these different mechanisms of how it could work, you would have expected more. Okay. But that's what we got in this one particular study. And then based off of, I don't know what data, I'll be very frank with you. They did a meta-analysis. Okay. They did a meta-analysis in 2017. And it says the effectiveness of green tea or green tea extract on insulin resistance and glycemic control in type 2 diabetes mellitus, a meta-analysis. And it says here that 6 studies were pooled into random effects meta-analysis. Overall, no differences were found from green tea extract or green tea or the placebo for glycosylated hemoglobin. Even though it says that there was a drop of 0.32%, it said there was no difference. I don't know if it was not statistically significant. It doesn't give the p-value. The confidence intervals look okay. So I don't know how they determined that there was no difference between the placebo and green tea extract based off of a couple of issues. Number one, I do see a drop of A1C here. Number one. Number two, I could not find any good studies on EGCG, okay, for A1C. So I don't know where these studies came from, to be honest. I'm very skeptical of this meta-analysis from 2017 showing that there's no improvement, okay? Because when I searched the medical literature on the National Library of Medicine or PubMed, if you type in EGCG A1C, there are 4 results that come back. Now, how does that compare to some other medications? Well, let's look at metformin in A1C. You see that 1,973 studies come back. How about glyburide? 158 studies. Again, a pharmaceutical. I was kind of expecting more, but still 158 studies compared to 4, right? How about semaglutide or Ozempic or the other medication, formulations that use semaglutide? 154 studies. And that's a new medication, right? So it's pretty new. At least metformin's pretty old. Okay, you maybe expect a lot more studies with metformin because it's older. How about GLP-1? Okay, well, yeah, we're getting a lot more, right? GLP-1 and A1C, which is the type of medication that semaglutide is, 1360. And that's a fairly new class of medications, right? And then Farxiga, one of the other medications we use, is an A1C. Let me move this out of the way real fast. There were 263, also a fairly newer medication. So you see the amount of data that's being pushed towards pharmaceuticals is gigantic, probably 1,000-fold or more than 1,000-fold, compared to little old green tea extract or EGCG, right? We get 4. Somehow they were able to find 6 studies for this meta-analysis and say that it had no effect, when the only one that I actually found personally showed a significant reduction in A1C by 0.4%. I just want to let you know, this is how they do it, right? This is, they say there's no evidence to support consumption of green tea extract. You're right. There's very little evidence that it helps. Okay. There's 4 studies done, but instead of saying, the more honest phrase would be, we need more data. The data that we have is not supportive yet, but it's very weak amount of data. There's no studies to support. There's no studies that are really being done, so we really don't know the answer. They say no data or no evidence to support the claim or whatnot, right? So this is a little way of how medicine will take something that has beautiful proof of concept, right? There's multiple mechanisms of how it likely works. My gut tells me it probably has a profound effect, at least a 0.4% decrease in A1C, probably more as we study it more. But that being said, the proof of concept is clearly there through multiple mechanisms. And again, there's no work being done on this because there's no money to be made, okay? No one's going to fund a double-blind, human-controlled trial that's going to show efficacy comparable to a drug when they can't patent it. Sadly, this is how science works right now, which is why we need a big change in how we conduct studies. But I'll digress. Someone asked, can EGCG be used as an SGL2 inhibitor? I did not see that as a mechanism through what I saw. It doesn't mean that it's not that. I just didn't see that mechanism. The dosage by body weight, daily dose, other. So again, those dosages were given in mice, okay? And those dosages were huge because, to be very honest with you, I don't routinely give green tea extract, but I do routinely give EGCG. And the dosages are like 200 to like 400, upwards of like, I think on the upper end of normal, upper end of what we can give is like 600 to 800 milligrams per day, okay? So let's just say hypothetically, let me just calculate real fast. I'm 70 kilograms, okay? If I was to take 200 milligrams per kilogram, that would be 14,000 milligrams of green tea extract or EGCG. I don't think we can take apples to apples, which is why we need a lot more studies for humans, not just mice. The proof of concept is clearly there. It's just that we don't have enough studies on it. So I'm gonna move on to quercetin. So again, another supplement or phytochemical that we've talked about a lot on this channel, because quercetin has so many diverse actions. And honestly, we've just scratched the surface. We've just mostly talked about its glutamine effects, but I'll digress. So this paper was published in 2019, and it says in vitro and in vivo evidence that quercetin protects against diabetes and its complications, a systemic review of the literature. And it says here, quercetin, a typical flavonoid, possesses diverse biochemical and physiologic actions, including antiplatelet, estrogenic, and anti-inflammatory properties. The review mainly centers on recent 10 years, finding that with respect to intervening diabetes and its complications with well-known flavonoid quercetin. After a short introduction of quercetin, major in vitro and in vivo findings are summarized, showing that quercetin is a promising molecule for the treatment of these diseases. Finally, we contemplate further development and application prospects of quercetin, despite the wealth of animal research suggesting the anti-diabetic and its complication potential of quercetin, its efficacy in diabetic human subject is yet to be explored. Okay, so again, quercetin has unbelievable proof of concept. It has, like it says here, a wealth of animal research suggesting anti-diabetic effects, yet its efficacy in human subjects is yet to be explored. And this is as of 2019, okay? Not a whole lot of human studies that have been conducted at that time. So this is just a paper, or not paper, but a graphic of this particular paper showing where quercetin can come from. Your source of quercetin may vary depending on how it affects your GKI or your health condition, right? We probably wouldn't want you eating a lot of fruit if you had cancer, but maybe tea and onions would be a better choice for you potentially. Again, how would it affect your GKI? Maybe you can have a couple of raspberries. It's not going to throw your GKI off that much. So in this paper, it also talks about multiple mechanisms of how quercetin is proposed to work for a variety of conditions. And it's talking about how it affects several important signaling pathways, such as AMPK. It's going to upregulate the transporters that bring glucose into the cells. It's going to upregulate receptors of insulin. It's going to repair some of the damage caused by oxidative stress of these pancreatic beta cells, the ones that actually make insulin, which makes them allow them to make insulin more effectively. It's going to change certain glucose transporters and enzymes that allow for glucose absorption within the actual gut lumen and the small intestine. And it's going to increase activity of glucokinase to enhance glucose storage. All of these mechanisms are able to help the overall control of blood glucose. Further on, in kind of a more broad sense, quercetin affects several signaling cascades, including the PIK3, AKT, NRF2 pathway, which upregulate endogenous antioxidants. NRF2 is one of the major antioxidant response elements and help protect against oxidative stress. Key point, within normal cells. Within normal cells. PIK3, AKT pathway to help enhance autophagy. Again, in normal cells. AMPK seems to be a pretty broad, both within normal and cancer cells. And then some of these other pathways, such as the inflammatory pathways and the apoptosis signaling pathways, all show positive effects within a diabetic model. Keep that in mind. Some of these pathways actually have opposite effects within cancer, which helps us in our endeavor to employ metabolic therapy, which is pretty awesome. And it's kind of across the board with a lot of these flavonoids. Therapeutic potential of quercetin in the management of type 2 diabetes mellitus, published in 2022, says here that type 2 diabetes mellitus is characterized by low-grade inflammation and insulin resistance, and is closely linked to obesity. Type 2 diabetes mellitus is mainly controlled by lifestyle and dietary changes and oral anti-diabetic drugs, but require insulin in severe cases. Many of the drugs that are currently used to treat diabetes are costly and present adverse side effects. Several cellular, animal, and clinical studies have provided the compelling evidence that flavonoids have therapeutic potential in the management of diabetes and complications. Quercetin, is a flavonoid present in various natural sources, which has demonstrated in vitro and in vivo anti-diabetic properties. And it improves oral glucose tolerance, as well as pancreatic beta cell function to secrete insulin. It inhibits alpha-glucosidase and DDP4 enzymes, which prolong the half-life of glucagon-like peptide GLP-1 and glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide. So this graphic is pretty impressive because it kind of gives a lot more of the effects on the body when quercetin is introduced. So quercetin inhibits VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor. It suppresses alpha-glucosidase and alpha amylase, which decreases starch breakdown within the gut, right? Inhibition of HMG-CoA reductase. Funny enough, that's exactly what statins do, reducing cholesterol levels. Inhibition of the CTGF and TGF-beta improves renal function. Suppresses CYP E1 liver enzyme, prevents oxidative damage in the liver. Decreases A1C levels, prevents pancreatic beta cell damage. Decreases AST, ALT. Those are the hepatic liver-related enzymes that are elevated when there's damage to the liver. Improves liver function and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And inhibits inflammation through reducing IL-1, 4, 6, 8, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNF alpha. So again, one molecule has multiple effects on human health. And that's not even talking about its effects on glutamine, which we will talk about, or we have talked about at length, but we will talk a little bit about in this particular time today. So again, quercetin, this is what this molecule is. It doesn't say it, but this I stole it from the same paper. Again, improves cardiovascular function, renal function, liver function, gastrointestinal, has effects on gastrointestinal tracts and the pancreas. And I want to digress just for a moment, because this is cancer is a metabolic disease, talk. And I think it would be important to not ignore this. So this came from this paper also. And I thought this was fascinating because obviously I've done like pretty extensive literature searches, and somehow, again, this slipped through the cracks on my end. But quercetin, as you see here, also has blocking effects on this glutamine cysteine antiporter called SLC7A11 or XCT, which is critical, for the impairment of the production of cancer-related glutathione, which allows for lipid peroxidation and ferroptosis. Okay, so going back to our classic kind of graphic when we were talking about glutamine, quercetin, we know, blocks SLC1A5, which is a glutamine transporter. Okay, it's a straight up glutamine transporter, and many things that we've showed have blocked this. Okay, blocks glutamine uptake. It also blocks glutamine utilization by blocking this GLUD or glutamine dehydrogenase enzyme. Okay, similar to EGCG. But now, for a third mechanism of how it works, it actually blocks SLC7A11. I'm actually going to, on the fly, add this little circle here so that we can highlight this. It actually also blocks SLC7A11, this also known as XC, okay? This glutamine cysteine antiporter, which is so critical, actually called the Achilles heel of cancer, in blocking glutathione production for cancer cells that allow reactive oxygen species to be able to build up and cause lipid peroxidation and ultimately ferroptosis within cancer cells. I thought that was fascinating. Now, what you'll also notice here, again, which is why I'm not a huge fan of recommending CoQ10, vitamin E, or any other really dedicated antioxidant, especially lipid-soluble antioxidants, because that helps prevent lipid-related ROS and ferroptosis within the cancer model. Okay, doesn't mean it's not good for the healthy cells. Okay, it just means that when we're talking about cancer, our strategy is to create lipid peroxidation within cancer cells, and we're doing that through multiple mechanisms. One of which by blocking this XCT, or this glutamine cysteine antiporter, also known as SLC7A11, which we have a whole like kind of micro series about. Okay, but you see here, this blocks it. So does deferoxamine and the CPX. It blocks iron. It actually chelates iron so that iron can't participate in what they call the Fenton reaction, which is not shown here in this paper or in this graphic. Okay, so there's multiple ways to block these processes from happening, and there's multiple ways to enhance this process from happening. So one of the ways we can enhance this from happening is quercetin. And again, quercetin's a rock star within cancer because not only does it have effects on A1C and blood glucose and all the other things, which we'll talk about, in the future, but it also has profound effects on the glutaminergic system at multiple levels. Again, glucose uptake at multiple levels, as well as glutamine uptake, glutamine utilization at multiple levels as well, which help basically, in our endeavor of treating cancers and metabolic disease and exploiting the Achilles heels of cancer, which Dr. Seyfried has laid out in multiple papers, glucose and glutamine. Quercetin is a rock star. But I have to digress off of glutamine, because even though this was an exciting finding for me, and hopefully for you as well, we got to get back on target here. So we're talking about quercetin's effects on diabetes, right? So again, this paper was published in 2022, Quercetin for Managing Type 2 Diabetes and Its Complications, and Insight to Multi-Target Therapy. It says quercetin acts on multiple targets of diabetes and regulates key signaling pathways which improve the symptoms as well as complications of type 2 diabetes. And it's in the graphic that it shows in this paper is very similar to the graphic we've seen kind of in other papers. So I don't really want to rehash this, but the bottom line is there's multiple mechanisms of how quercetin works. Now, where the rubber meets the road, what about its effects on blood glucose, and what about its effects on A1C? So let's take a look at this paper that was published in 2019. It says effects of quercetin supplementation on glycemic control among patients with metabolic syndrome and related disorders, a systemic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. So again, how strong can this meta-analysis really be when in the same year it says that the efficacy of human subjects is yet to be explored? The same year, 2019, right, as this meta-analysis. They're making pretty broad claims, right, based off of very limited, probably, data, because it's not been studied very heavily. So again, these were done. So in subgroup analysis, quercetin supplementation significantly reduced fasting blood glucose in studies with a duration of longer than 8 weeks. If doses were more than 500 milligrams per day. In addition, subgroup analysis revealed a significant reduction in insulin concentration following supplementation with quercetin studies that enrolled 8 individuals less than 45 years old, and that quercetin was used in greater than 500 milligrams per day. But that's kind of a non-issue because most people who get put on quercetin by their doctor are going to be on dosages that are much higher than 500 milligrams per day. But I'll digress. In summary, subgroup analysis based on duration of 8 weeks, of a duration of greater than 8 weeks, and quercetin dosage of greater than 500 significantly reduce fasting blood glucose. Okay, so we know that it reduces fasting blood glucose if we use it for more than 8 weeks and if it's greater than 500 milligrams per day. Now, one of the, I guess, fears, and I completely understand the fear, okay? A lot of the flavonoids, a lot of the nutraceuticals don't have exactly fantastic absorption compared to a pharmaceutical or compared to what we call a parenteral route of administration, like intramuscular injection, subcutaneous injections, intravenous infusions of things are going to have much higher availability, okay, into the actual bloodstream, okay. But I want to kind of quelch some of these fears in some ways, because some of the ways that these chemicals work, in particular quercetin, it actually decreases blood glucose absorption by having effects within the small intestine itself, okay. Basically, some of the effects of how quercetin works means that it actually doesn't need to be absorbed into the system, nor is it beneficial that it's absorbed in the system, because we're missing out on part of the effects if we were to give it through an IV and get 100% of the bloodstream. So some of these effects are through the gut enzymes like these maltase and alpha glucosidase and different things like that. And then in addition to that, one of the ways that some of these things work is through, I'm not sure where the graphic is at. Is it here? Stand by. I don't know if I have a straight up graphic for it, but what it can also do is regulate diabetes by improving gut barrier function, okay, and kind of causing a balancing act of the intestinal microbiome, okay, the gut flora or the bacteria inside your colon. So if it was all being absorbed, let's say we gave an IV EGCG, we're going to get effects probably above and beyond what we would get if we took a pill, right? Or if we took a liposomal formulation or something like that, because it's going to get all into the bloodstream. And we're going to get probably more effects on areas where it affects within the bloodstream and then subsequently inside the cells. But we may be missing the boat on some of these other maybe really important ways that it affects blood glucose by affecting, GI tract related enzymes to absorb blood glucose, but also in its ability to modulate the intestinal microbiome to affect inflammation, to affect certain hormones, to affect the blood sugar in a kind of more roundabout way, if that makes sense. So the next paper I want to talk about was a study that was published in 2024 in June. And this was really, if you want me to be very frank, the really only good paper that I could find looking at specifically A1C, because that's kind of the best way to look at these substances about how it affects your A1C. Because remember, A1C, or glycosylated hemoglobin, is essentially looking at your average blood glucose for a period of about 120 days. Okay. So it's a much more effective way of looking at blood glucose than like a fasting blood glucose or like a random blood glucose. That is not giving us near as good a story or good of a picture into blood glucose than A1C is. So that's why I try to look for studies for that. So this paper is titled Benefits of Quercetin on Glycosylated Hemoglobin, Blood Pressure, PIKO6 readings, nighttime sleep, anxiety, and quality of life in patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus, a randomized controlled trial. And these people were given 500 milligrams of quercetin. Again, not a very high dose. That's kind of like the minimum dose that we would give for 12 weeks. And then they would follow them for later. And it says here that compared to control, glycosylated hemoglobin showed a significant decrease in 4% versus 0.1%. Okay, so there was a 4% change, it says, versus 0.1% in the control. And I was a little bit, I'll be very honest with you. I was very dumbfounded by that. I was saying, so you're telling me that someone's A1C dropped from 8 to 4%? That, as much as I think quercetin is an unbelievable chemical, and it's one of my favorite flavonoids, especially within the realm of cancers and metabolic disease, that seems extreme. I don't think that seems true. That doesn't seem possible. So I dug through the actual like paper, and I found this graph here. And what I found was, again, a negative 0.28% change compared to baseline. That's more like it, right? Like, as much as I would like to see it be, 0.6% or a 1% decrease in A1C, what we really got was a 0.28%, maybe almost a 0.3% decrease in A1C, which is, I think it's notable. It's, it's improving your glycemic control. But it's not like earth-shattering either. It's not 4%. I'm not really sure what kind of like mumbo jumbo they did with the numbers. I'm not a mathematician nor a statistician to understand like how they got this 4%. But the bottom line is, in the control group, here you see here, the A1C actually went up slightly. And in the intervention group, it went down. I guess it was a 0.929% if you look at from the control, right? Bottom line is not groundbreaking, definitely not 4%, but still having profound effects. And again, a lot of times we're not using, I never would have thought to use quercetin, if you want me to be very honest with you, as an agent for diabetes, for hyperglycemia, for improving your GKI. Now, would I like to see it used for these purposes? Blocking SLC185, glutamine dehydrogenase, SLC7811 as part of the glutamine side of things? Absolutely. There's even some significant glucose or glycolysis inhibiting blocking effects as well, which we'll talk about when we talk about the inhibition of glucose within the cell. We're now talking about outside the cell, but within the cell. So quercetin's clearly a rock star within this area, but I was not expecting to see, unbelievable effects. I mean, 0.28% is not nothing, but it was more than I was expecting, because I wasn't ever thinking about using quercetin for this purposes. So I think that there's definitely promise with this, especially when combined with other things that we know there's synergistic effects. But I'll digress. So quercetin, again, rock star, and has effects on lowering blood glucose, average blood glucose, by about 0.28%, looking at a hemoglobin A1C after about 12 weeks of quercetin at 500 milligrams. Again, not a very crazy high dose. I wonder what would happen if we used doses closer to what we use within functional integrative medicine. Will we see, higher effects? My gut tells me, no pun intended, talking about microbiome, that it probably does. But again, more studies need to be done. June 15 of 2025, this is really only the good randomized controlled trial that I've seen on diabetes with quercetin, and they have the audacity back in 2019 to say that that even though they did admit that there was a significant blood glucose decreases, there just wasn't a lot of studies back then on quercetin. So hopefully people get woken up in the research community, and they get incentivized to do studies about these cheap, free things. Not free because you have to eat something like an apple or a cherry or something like that to get it. But the bottom line is, these things are natural and likely much more safe and have pleiotropic effects, particularly within cancer. All right, the last thing I want to share about is garlic. And garlic was kind of a sleeper for me. I did not realize it was going to have such a profound effect on glucose. I know garlic is kind of an unbelievable chemical, and allicin, one of its major chemicals within garlic. And this graphic, really kind of encapsulates that in a lot of ways, because we have the garlic bulb here, and then we have like dozens, literally dozens, right, of different chemical cascades and pathways that are beneficial to our health, related to angiogenesis, oxidative stress, platelet aggregation, cholesterol, inflammation, apoptosis, you name it, endothelial function, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So garlic's pretty unbelievable. And it says here in this paper, which is titled Roles and Mechanisms of Garlic and its Extracts on Atherosclerosis, or the Hardening of the Arteries, or Coronary Artery Disease, or CAD, a review. Primary and secondary prevention using alternative supplements and methods to avoid or reduce the use of traditional pharmacologic drugs have also become popular. One of the reasons for this is the pharmacological drugs and lipid lowering and blood pressure lowering effects cause many side effects that may negatively impact quality of life. Of course, you would never get that by looking at a TV commercial. They just make it seem like you're just going to like living in heaven, basically. But that being said, in order to reveal garlic applications in the prevention and treatment of AS, or atherosclerosis, reviewing the latest domestic and international studies through searching databases, the result shows that the anti-atherogenic role of garlic is exogenous, and the mechanisms are mainly related to hypolipidemic, antioxidant, antithrombotic, inhibiting angiogenesis, protecting endothelial cells, anti-inflammatory, and apoptosis. It's kind of funny how they worded that. It was making it seem like, oh, it's mainly secondary, it's mainly related to its glucose lowering effects. But when it said it's mainly related to, it does freaking everything, right? So it's kind of funny how they worded that. And regulating the gut microbiota, or microbiome. The main signaling pathways involve AMPK, TLRs, KEAP, NRF2, PIK3, AKT, PPAR, GEF, HE. Essentially, it's basically looking at, talking about a bunch of these signaling cascades. And again, one of the things I'll mention by just looking at this kind of gestalt slide, right, is that it has effects on the sirtuin systems, okay, as well as the KEAP, NRF2, or the antioxidant response elements, which all have effects on inflammation and oxidative stress, right? And it's interesting because a lot of these chemical substances, natural substances, again, to reiterate, have effects on these pathways in normal cells. And then in a cancer cell, it has actually opposite effects that actually lower the antioxidant potential within cancer cells to allow them to be more susceptible to oxidative stress and basically apoptosis, ferroptosis, or necrosis of these cancer cells, which I think is really fascinating. And I cannot stop being amazed by that. So allicin, one of the major chemicals within garlic, allicin modulates intestinal microbiota to attenuate blood glucose and systemic inflammation in type 2 diabetic rats. Okay. So again, looking at something that is a very, I think, important and maybe underappreciated point about a lot of these chemicals. Okay. One of many ways that these flavonoids and these polyphenols and these chemicals affect how our overall systemic health is doing is through alterations in the gut microbiome, or the bacteria in the colon. Okay, and so therefore, if I was to inject you with garlic, okay, like let's say we did an IV infusion of garlic or allicin, which may or may not be a good idea, but let's say we did that because we want to take advantage of some of these effects, right, and have more absorption, we'd be missing out on a very important way that it affects blood glucose through remodulation of the gut microbiome. So I just want to make that as an important point, that maybe increased absorption of some of these things is not as critical as we may think. Okay. Another effect of garlic on having an anti-diabetic effect, as we've seen in several other nutraceuticals or natural products, is that it affects the absorption of carbohydrates at the level of the small intestine. It inhibits enzymes in the actual gut lumen that break down carbohydrates to allow them to be absorbed. So again, if garlic was highly absorbed in the small intestine and it didn't have this effect, would it have such a profound effect on your A1C, on your blood glucose? I dare say no. Same paper. Basically, what this is showing is now hyper focused on glucose and hyperglycemia and diabetes, right? And insulin resistance. Is it showing the bioactive compounds of garlic, right? Having effects on pancreatic beta cells to improve their performance, okay? Having effects on different enzymes and transporters that allow for the endogenous insulin secretion when necessary, as well as improvements in glycogenolysis or making new glycogen. So again, taking blood sugar out of the system, putting into a more of a storage form to protect against the damages of high blood glucose and high insulin, and other enzymes that help in the increasing of insulin, again, when necessary, okay, to help deal with high blood sugar, ultimately having an anti-diabetic effect. So one of the other ways that garlic affects diabetes and blood glucose levels is through effects on mitochondria. If anybody remembers from our mitochondrial series, one of the ways that we improve mitochondrial performance is we increase something called mitochondrial biogenesis. And mitochondrial biogenesis is mainly regulated through this TFAM and PGC1 alpha. Okay. And PGC1 alpha will stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis, which will improve membrane potential, increasing mitochondrial related enzymes, increasing ATP, oxygen consumption, and also has, actually sirtuins, funny enough, have effects on PGC1 alpha and vice versa, the sirtuin systems. So for those antioxidant response, as well as altering pink parkin, which is important for mitophagy, as well as the decreases in mitochondrial fission, Okay, so fission of mitochondria, where they break apart, is considered a more pathologic state when it's in excess, and that can also decrease mitochondrial performance and lead mitochondria to become more leaky to reactive oxygen species. And what garlic is doing is also altering mitochondrial dynamics in a way that mitochondria are more effective at producing ATP and reducing oxidative stress. So again, the other way that garlic can work is through improving mitochondrial function. So what does it mean when the rubber meets the road, though? Okay, when we look at studies in humans of people actually getting garlic and having an effect on their blood sugar and their A1C respectively. So this is a systemic review and meta-analysis of garlic on lipid profile and glucose parameters published in 2019, And it says here that the fasting blood glucose and A1C serum showed significant decreases of 10 milligrams per deciliter. So fasting blood sugar dropped by 10. And then the A1C dropped by 0.6%, which I thought was pretty cool. And then that was backed up by a new meta-analysis in 2024, May 2024, effects on garlic on glucose parameters and lipid profile, a systemic review and meta-analysis on randomized controlled trials. And it says here, we found that garlic intervention was effective at controlling fasting blood glucose and mean glucose, or average blood glucose by looking at an A1C or hemoglobin A1C by 0.66%. So much stronger, in studies than quercetin or EGCG, although I do believe that both EGCG and quercetin are sickeningly unstudied, as we could see by the 4 papers that I was able to find when I searched for EGC and A1C. But my point is that garlic was kind of a sleeper for me. I didn't realize it was going to have as much of an effect as it did. Matter of fact, it has more of an effect than berberine, which we'll look at in probably the next video, looking at berberine, which is kind of like held up to be, one of the more strong flavonoids against diabetes and improving A1C and blood sugar. So again, garlic could be a great addition to our purposes for improving our health overall, as well as potentially adding into metabolic therapy. Now, what I would say is that, you know, the issue is that we can get pretty bogged down by taking a lot of stuff. Okay, it can be very confusing and dizzying, actually, taking so many things. All right. So my point is that one of the reasons why I'm a huge fan of quercetin and EGCG is because they do have effects on blood glucose, although modest. Okay, they also have profound effects on other things like glucose inhibition at the level of the cell, right, through glycolysis. They have effects on glutamine, okay, processing. They have other effects related to cancer outside of glucose lowering in the bloodstream, which is why, you know, when you pick things for a program, it may make more sense to pick things that have kind of a diverse effect. But if you, like, let's say hypothetically, you want to start metabolic therapy, but you have terrible glycemic control and your glucose is very high, your A1C is high, you're on medications for this, then it may make more sense. Again, talk to your doctor and come up with a plan with him or her. But it may make more sense to look for things that don't have as profound of effects on glutamine and maybe glucose inhibition within the cell, which we will have a whole micro or macro series on. But it may be better to start out with things that don't have effects on those things, but help get your blood sugar down maximally so that you can participate in metabolic therapy. Because again, if your blood glucose is high or higher than we want it to be, which is very low, and your glucose ketone index or GKI is not where we want it to be, then the other things, you know, those are foundational principles. So therefore, if we don't have that under control first, it doesn't really matter what you add to the process. You know, you may be wasting your money spinning your wheels by adding those things in. So maybe in your case, depending on what your specific N=1 is, maybe adding garlic to your program earlier to get your glucose levels down. And then once your glucose levels are more controlled and you have less insulin resistance, then adding in things that don't have as much of an effect on glucose, but have profound effects on the glutamine system, like quercetin. Okay. So again, not telling you what to do or how to practice medicine here on YouTube here, but just giving you kind of like strategies of how maybe programs could be formulated going forward using some of these nutraceuticals, which have effects on multiple systems, which are important for metabolic therapy as a whole. I'm going to take a look at what we have here in the comments. Someone says, great info. Thank you, Sean. This is why public funds must fund research for the common good. True. I mean, completely true. I mean, isn't it kind of disgusting that something like so cheap and easily obtainable and safe, like EGCG or quercetin, they have very little studies, whereas the pharmaceuticals, they have thousands of studies. I mean, it's just really is frustrating. We do need public funds to go to fund these kind of things, because public funds shouldn't be about making profit. It should be about improving the health of the population. But again, I'll digress. Hey, doctor, I took a class and it was amazing. Thank you. I sent you an email about the information I sent. Would you be able to take a look? Yes, I'll have my my RN Jordan take a look at that. Sorry we missed it. We get so many emails, my friend. And thank you for taking the class. I hope that it was beneficial for you. What about decaf form of EGCG? Well, EGCG has nothing to do with caffeine. So yes, most EGCG, kind of like substances or supplements that I've seen have nothing to do with caffeine, and most of them are decaffeinated. So it should not matter whether caffeine's present or not, because this is one specific catechin within green tea, not green tea as a whole. Now, if you're looking at green tea extract, there may be benefits to the caffeine, because it's not looking at one particular chemical within green tea. But I'll digress. That's kind of a nuance. Bonjour de France. Man, I wish I spoke French. I will say bonjour also to you. It's about all I know. Maybe je m'appelle Casey. That's about all I know from my French class from high school. Hi from Morocco. Thank you for your videos, doctor. Bravo por tes videos. Thank you, doctor, for sharing the insights and knowledge-filled videos. Wishing you and everyone good health, success, and happiness. Much love. Happy from California. Well, Much love and happiness. Happy Friday from Florida to you in California. Is garlic even better than chromium? Like, out of so many supplements, what are your top 3 for glucose control? Man, that's a great question. You know, if you let me be very honest with you guys, I use this as a way for me to learn too, you know? So did I know that in one study that chromium lowered someone's, A1C by 3%, literally 3%. On average, in a meta-analysis, it's 0.7%. I think it's 0.71 to be exact. Or did I know that, I don't know, things we'll talk about in the future have more than a 1% increase in decrease in blood or in A1C that are even more shocking? No, I didn't know. I learned this on the fly, just like, when I'm going through the literature. Obviously, I have some understanding because I did take all the functional medicine integrative courses that I could find, on these kind of subjects, and they were okay, but they're scratching the surface. When you get into the actual medical literature, you learn a lot more stuff. So, top 3 as of right now, without completely ruining my next video, I would say milk thistle semilaurin, probably the top one. Chromium, maybe cinnamon, actually. That might be my top 3. But again, it's hard for me to put them in a vacuum because there's so many things that are good. And sometimes I want things that dovetail into metabolic therapy, right? That have effects on glucose and glutamine. So therefore, I may pick one that has slightly less effects on glucose to get the benefits of the glutamine side of things, It's still an inexact science, and I think that we have a lot of work to do, but we're trying to do it, If there's no more questions, I'm going to probably sign off. We've got an hour and 1 minute. I was thinking that today was going to be a shorter one, but again, there's just so much to share about all these different flavonoids and their effects on blood glucose. There was a last second question. What needs sugar? Fungus. What does that hate? Garlic. Just connect the dots. Look, I'm not saying there's no connection between fungus and cancer. Okay. I think there's connection, but I think it's also very myopic to say that cancer and fungus are only related together and there's nothing else connecting. There's no other dots to connect. There's many dots to connect, including diabetes, including obesity, including vitamin D deficiency, including light at night. All those things also connect dots. And I'm not saying that only light at night causes cancer and contributes to cancer, although it definitely does, right? I'm not saying that only obesity or vitamin D deficiency causes cancer or leads to cancer doing worse, although it does, right? It's multiple things. We're being hit from multiple areas. So again, although I think Mark Lintern and his, theory and book and things like that, I've listened to him speak, are excellent. And I think it makes a lot of sense. This is kind of like a foundational principle of internal medicine. Okay. We want to have what they call a differential diagnosis. Okay. You don't want to just be fixated on one thing. We want to be looking at multiple things. And really, I would say the job of a good doctor is to help figure out what those multiple things are for you that could be causing cancer for you and leading to the driving of cancer for you, and help remove those things from your life so that you can improve your health. Right. And so I do think that the fungus, there's definitely something there. There's no question at all. Thanks, Doc. Hopefully we'll get to hear about other flavonoids soon. Oh, yes, you will. You will on Monday. No worries. No need to fret. I think GKI is very important. It is. It's critical, foundational. So that's why we're taking so much time to give you as many tools in your tool bag to lower blood glucose as a way to improve your GKI, to get you into the therapeutic strategies that augment or enhance or complete, maybe would be a better word, metabolic therapy. I hope this was helpful. If you like these videos, please like, share, and subscribe. And until next time.